Alright, time for Chapter 7. So Chapter 7 is focusing now on the skeletal system. So we'll cover just the bone tissue part for Chapter 7, and then Chapter 8 actually looks at all of the bones for the skeletal system. For that chapter, what's going to be covered for the exam is only 8.1. The rest of that chapter, so 8.2 and through the end of the chapter, will be covered on the bone exam. So the skeletal system is made of the bones, the cartilages that are in between the bones, and the ligaments that connect bone to bone. Also involved with the system are the tendons that attach muscle to bone. So the functions for the skeleton are to support our, so for support, we have our limbs are supported, our vertebrae help our body to stand up, our jawbones support our teeth, so hold them in place, and then some bones will help to support our viscera or internal organs. The brain, spinal cord, heart, and lungs are protected by the skull, the vertebrae, and your rib cage. When muscles contract, they help to cause movement. And your bones are like a mineral bank, so they help to balance the calcium and phosphate levels in the body. So both of those are ions that are part of other molecules that ionize in water, so they're also part of electrolytes. Your skeleton also works with the acid-base balance in the body, so maintaining the body's pH. So by adjusting the phosphate and carbonate salt levels help to adjust the pH in the body. And then lastly, on the inside of bones, you have red bone marrow, and that in your red bone marrow, it produces your blood cells. So your white blood cells and your red blood cells, as well as your platelets. So bone, also called osseous tissue, is a type of connective tissue. And the matrix for this type of connective tissue is hardened by calcium phosphate and other minerals. So the process to mineralize that matrix is called mineralization or calcification. And your bones themselves, which are individual organs, each one of them, so your femur is an organ, your os coxa or your hip bone is also its own separate organ, is made of bone tissue, the bone marrow that's on the inside, the cartilage that covers it to protect it. There's some fat tissue or adipose tissue. There's nervous tissue that runs through the middle of your bones and so into your bones and around in other locations, as well as some fibrous connective tissue on the outside of the bone to protect it. So there's different types of bones. So the first type of bone are flat bones. These are usually thin curved plates. So for example, this skull cap here, very thin and in this shape very curved. And job for your flat bones is to protect different soft organs. So for example, the sternum that's in your rib cage will protect your heart. Next category are your long bones. So these are bones that are longer than they are wide. So for example, in the arm and forearm region, come on, bend. Okay, whatever. So long bones there, as well as your femur in your leg and the tibia and fibula in the lower portion of your leg. And then the next one are your short bones. So they're about as roughly kind of square-ish. So they're about as long as they are wide. So for example, the carpal bones that are in your wrist area, as well as the tarsals that are in your kind of the upper part of your foot, so in that region, as well as your somewhat shorter bones, in like the ones that make up your phalanges, as well as your toes. There you go. The last shape are your irregular bones. So basically the ones that don't fit in all the other categories, like your os coxa, which is your hip bone, and around your vertebrae, which are along your spine. So general features of bone. So you learned this a little bit during the tissue chapter. On the outside of bone is your compact bone. So pulling this out again. So compact bone here, so very little space in between where all your components of that tissue is. And then on the middle is your spongy bone, or also called cancellous bone. So it's more loosely organized and random patterns there. Of course, they're organized to follow the pressures that are put on the bone. So they're built so that that bone can withstand those pressures in that particular direction. And then, of course, covered by the compact bone. So your skeleton is mostly compact bone by weight, even though it's smaller amount of area, but it's on the outside and that contains a lot of weight. And then 1/4 spongy bone. So going back to our long bones. So our long bones have different features. So the first feature is the diaphysis, which is the shaft that produces leverage. So it's this middle section here. And then inside your diaphysis is your marrow cavity. It contains your bone marrow. It's also called your medullary cavity. And at the ends of these long bones, so like here, at the top of your humerus, part of your arm, also down here where it kind of bulges out. Where's the other bone? There it is. So also on your femur. So these bulgy areas, it's called the epiphysis. So they're in large ends of the long bone. They help to strengthen the joint, so it gives a little bit more area to carry weight, as well as provide areas for anchoring our ligaments and tendons. So for example, on this femur bone, you have this little dent or divot in the head of the femur. So this little dent is called the fovea capitis. And that's where a tendon will attaches to the femur. So all the different little surfaces that you're going to learn when you do the bones, a lot of those surfaces are just gives the tissue an area to attach to the bone. So still continuing on with the long bone. So again, we have our epiphyses, which are at the enlarged or head regions, or here at the bottom also, where they're large near a joint. Diaphysis is the shaft in the middle between them, both being made of both compact and spongy bone. So compact on the outside, spongy bone on the inside, and that spongy bone is filled with the marrow cavity, either with red or yellow marrow. Your long bones are covered all the way around by a membrane called the periosteum. So connective tissue just helps as a protection for your bones. And then specifically at joints, you have what's called articular cartilage. So articular cartilage is found where the two bones are going to meet at a joint. So for certain joints, you have cartilages that are there. So here we have a os coxa, or our hip bone. And then the os coxa, or hip bone, makes a joint with the femur. And here in our picture, we see the articular cartilage. So here we would have articular cartilage on this little round knob, or the head of the femur. And sticking into our hip socket, that articular cartilage keeps those two bones from rubbing against each other. Okay, now moving on to flat bones. So flat bones have a more sandwich-like construction. So we have two layers of compact bone on the outside, like bread, one layer in the middle, that's kind of like the filling. Both surfaces are covered with periosteum, so you have periosteum on the outside and periosteum on the inside. The middle layer is called the diploe. It helps to absorb shock, so get smacked upside the head with a baseball bat. Helps to prevent your brain from getting bashed in, so it kind of provides a little bit of shock, so you're not cracking your skull open. And with your diploe, so the spongy middle layer, that middle layer is also filled with marrow, and the marrow is also lined with endosteum. So just some general features of bone. So again, you have on the most external surface, you have the articular cartilage. So that's the cartilage that's only at joints. So it also helps your joints to move more freely because they are covered in that cartilage. Another thing that's in your joints are little small holes that allow your blood vessels to penetrate. So some of the ones that are like, for example, on your skull, and I'll start with one that you have to know for the bone exam. So above your eye socket is the supraorbital foramen. So this little dent right here in the right above where the eye socket is. So that little hole, which is why we have the human skulls in the lab to study with, because on the plastic model, you can't actually see it's a hole, it's just like a little dimple. Same thing here in the mandible, this mental foramen, so this would technically be a hole that would allow the blood vessels to penetrate. So connective tissue on the outside and inside of the bones. So lining the outside is your periosteum. That covers the external surfaces of the bone. Then you have your compact bone, your spongy bone, and then on the inside of your spongy bone that lines your marrow cavity is your endosteum. Last general feature of bone is the epiphyseal plate, also called the growth plate. So later we'll cover this, how our long bones grown. So eventually, once all of the hyaline cartilage that was originally in that epiphyseal plate region, once it fully grows, so our child has grown into a full height adult, that epiphyseal plate will now become the epiphyseal line, so it's a kind of like a scar of bone where the growth plate used to be. So once there's no more growth in the length direction, then that growth plate will just harden over, and there's a literal line near the head of your long bone. So like near the epiphyses, so separating that from your diaphyses. Okay, so there's two types of bone cells in your bone osseous tissue or bone tissue. So the first type are your osteoblasts, which are your bone builder cells. The other types are your osteoclasts, which are going to be your cells that will help to remodel your bone, so to reabsorb the bone. So instead of building the bone up, tearing the bone down. So first one, your osteoblasts, they start off as a osteogenic cell. This cell then develops into our osteoblasts. Eventually, these osteoblasts are going to build up the collagen that becomes mineralized into bone tissue. And as they're making that collagen, eventually they get trapped in the bone tissue or osseous tissue. And eventually they're going to become an osteocyte. And those osteocytes, although they're trapped in their little cave called a lacuna, those osteocytes are still able to play a role in just your bone organs functioning. So as you see on here, the little picture where it has these extensions off the osteocyte, it allows that osteocyte to communicate to other cells, helps to communicate, for example, when your bone is receiving pressure in an area. So it's not just a cell that's just kind of stuck in its own little hole. It's actually still part of a functioning member of the bone tissue. So here's just the text version. So starting off osteogenic sites, then becoming the osteoblasts, which eventually make the soft organic matter of the matrix, so the collagen fibers that are hardened by minerals. Those osteoblasts also help to stimulate the osteogenic cells to create more osteoblasts. And also it secretes osteocalcin, which is a hormone, to stimulate insulin secretion by the pancreas, as well as increase insulin sensitivity in the adipocytes or fat cells. Eventually, osteoblasts become osteocytes, trapped in their lacuna, so there's little tiny cavities or caves where they are now trapped inside of the osseous tissue. So there's little canals or caniculi, these little channels that connect the different caves. So those little cell extensions are where they travel through those caniculi to communicate to the other cells. So in order to communicate, they do so through gap junctions, so just allows things from past the cell to cell. And then again, they act as strain sensors, so as your bones having different pressures on them, helping to signal when to reabsorb the bone, or to regulate your bone remodeling so that the bone can correctly support the weight or strain on those joints and bone. So here's just a picture of it. So you're an osteocyte, and then the extensions, of course, this is tissue that's been preserved, so it looks a little funny, but extensions off the cell, and those extensions will run into the caniculi to communicate to the next lacuna, next osteocyte that's in a lacuna. Next type of bone cell are your osteoclasts. So these are our bone dissolving cells, so they're going to dissolve or get rid of some of the bone, so unmodel it, so break it down. Your osteoclasts actually come from a different type of cell than your osteoblast. So they come from bone marrow stem cells, and they're very large because they're a fusion of several different stem cells. So below here, you have a microscope picture of a few osteoblasts, actually 2 mature ones there. So we have in blue, the blue dots are nuclei. So in this one, there's actually 4 nuclei in that cell, and this one there's 3. The rest of the staining in green are mitochondria. So in these cells, because they fuse several cells together, the nuclei don't fuse, and so they end up having multiple nuclei. Later, I'll show you a picture of the ruffled border. So that's where it faces the bone and will dissolve or break apart the bone. And they'll fit inside an area called the resorption bay, so to reabsorb the bone as it's breaking down the bone to help remodel it. So dissolving bone is part of remodeling. So, for example, when you have if you have braces, you're not just moving the teeth, you're actually completely remodeling the teeth. So the strain on your teeth as they're being pushed into a particular location, the osteoclasts are dissolving the bone from places where you don't need it. The osteoblasts are rebuilding the bone to places where you do need it. So that way it helps to shift the teeth. So you're not just pushing them around, you're actually remodeling the bone based on strain on the tissue. Strain on osseous tissue. So here's just the bone cells themselves, looking at their development. So our bone builders are osteoblasts, osteogenic cell to osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are building bone until they get trapped in lacuna and become osteocytes. Our bone dissolvers start off as stem cells, eventually becoming a osteoclast, and they'll fit into the resorption bay. So that's this little cave here, and here is the ruffled border. So later we'll actually go into how that ruffled border plays a role in dissolving the bone. So the matrix of the bone, which are your collagen fibers, which are mineralized, is made up of 2 types of matter. So the first type is our organic matter, which are made by our osteoblasts. And our osteoblasts make collagen fiber as well as carbohydrate protein complexes such as glycosaminoglycans, or GAG for short, proteoglycans, and glycoproteins. The inorganic matter, so the non-carbon based molecules that will mineralize around this organic matter, so mostly the collagen fibers, is mostly 85% of that's hydroxyapatite, so that's your main crystal. It's a type of calcium phosphate. The rest of it is calcium carbonate, and then other minerals like fluoride, sodium, potassium, and magnesium. So these two parts create a ceramic and a polymer to help with the function of the bone. So give it strength, but also give it flexibility. So the hydroxyapatite and the minerals are your ceramic portion. The collagen fibers are the polymers. So the ceramic portion helps to support the body weight, so give it strength. The polymer portion gives it the flexibility. Moving on to compact bone, so looking at it specifically. So if you open up your compact bone, it's structured in shapes called osteon, also called Haversian systems. These osteons are made up of concentric lamellae, so these are layers that surround the central canal, also called the Haversian canal. So here in our little picture, okay, let's try that again. Here in our picture, we have our central Haversian canal, so this allows your blood vessels and nerve to pass through the middle of the bone. And then around your central Haversian canal, you have layers of bone around it. So here in our little black and white picture, the central canal, where your blood vessels and nerves will run, and then around it are layers of lamellae, and these are just layers of your bone tissue. So these concentric laminae arranged in the osteon, so the whole little circle portion of that structure is a osteon. And in order for you to get your blood vessels and nerves into the center part of these osteons, it's through these perforating canals, so they'll enter into the bone and then cross over until they reach the particular Haversian canal. On the final outside layers of compact bone, instead of it still being organized in our circular osteon structures, it's just layers of concentric laminae on the outside. In between these circles, so like the little gaps in between, are called interstitial laminae, and it's just irregular regions in between the osteons. They're like older osteons that have now been pushed out of the way, so not compacted, but just kind of pushed out the way from the other osteons that have grown. So again, this is the compact bone that's on the outside of your spongy bone, which you can see here on the side. So pulling out the models again, so up here we have spongy bone, so filled with our marrow. Then, of course, the compact bone's on the outside of that. So we have these osteons here, which you can actually see the circular structure better with the concentric laminae around that central Haversian canal. So here showing the blood vessels there. Then you have your perforating canal to connect to different osteons. Then your concentric laminae, I'm just going to show you a different way to look at that. So the little stripes here are your collagen fibers that are going to be mineralized. And then on here it's showing the osteocytes, so our fully mature cells that are trapped in those lacuna. And then you can see the little cell extension through the caniculi to connect to the next cell. So also on here we have our outer layers, which are just concentric circumferential laminae out here on the outside, so it helps to widen the bone. And then finally covering all bone is the periosteum. So moving on to our spongy bone, so again on the middle of our compact bone. So there's two different structures in spongy bone. You have these small slivers, which are called your spicules, and then the thin plates called trabeculi. And all those little empty spaces are filled with bone marrow. So in your spongy bone, there's very few osteons, so the circular structures that we found easily in our compact bone. And there's no central canals in there since it's just filled with bone marrow. And so in that bone marrow, you do have kind of like the circulatory system running through the middle of it. Excuse me. Your spongy bone provides strength with minimal weight. So even though, again, it's called spongy, it's actually hard. So even though this is compact bone, but if we're just looking at this, it'd still be, you couldn't like, it's nice, strong structure. So minimal weight, so it has, you know, the gaps and empty spaces there, helps to reduce the weight of that bone. And the trabeculi develop along stress lines in the bone. So as, for example, when you have, let me skip quite a bit. There we go. For example, here in the head region of the femur, so the purple and red lines showing the weight that is put on those areas, so the strain on the bone. The spongy bone develops in those lines for their stress to make sure that your bone can support that weight. So I just wanted, there we go, nice one. So just showing you the trabeculi and the spicule. So spicule, see these little tiny little strips here, and then the plates are the trabeculi. And then all that is filled with your marrow. So here in this empty space for the marrow cavity. So speaking of bone marrow, so you have two types of bone marrow. Bone marrow is a type of soft tissue that's inside the marrow cavities of not only your long bones, but also in some of the space, in the marrow cavities of long bones and small spaces in the spongy bone. So the red marrow, which is also called myeloid tissue, because it produces your blood cells, so it produces all seven formed elements of your blood. So your red bone, your 5 white blood cells, your erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, so we're at 6, and the 7th being your platelets. Red bone marrow is found in nearly every bone in a child, but in adults it's only found in your skull, the vertebrae, ribs, your sternum, and part of your pelvic girdle, so the os coxa, part of that, and the head on the femur. The rest is, a lot of it is your yellow marrow, which is again only found in your in adults. It does not produce marrow, but it can transform back into red marrow if you need to, if you have like chronic anemia and need to make some more red blood cells. So that's it for this video. We're going to come back with a part 2 to finish up chapter 7 and hopefully also add in the 8.1 from chapter 8.